Right. It looks like we have a good amount of people. So I'd love to go ahead and start this event. Before we begin, I'm just going to give a brief introduction and welcome to everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our book talk, Blues for Black Childhood with Kinohi Nishikawa. I am Caroline Wood, Educational Programs Manager at Center for Book Arts. Center for Book Arts is a nonprofit arts organization founded in 1974. We host events, workshops, and opportunities for artists throughout the year. And right now, we're currently trying to raise $60,000 to support these programs by the end of the year. So if you'd like to support us, please visit the link that I'm going to put in the chat shortly after this introduction. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Center for Book Arts is located on the ancestral unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape people. Book Talk is a program hosted by Roni Gross. Roni is a book artist, a letterpress instructor, and a longtime member of the CBA community. So I will turn it over to Roni. Welcome, and we'll get started.
Roni, can you unmute yourself?
How embarrassing. Well, I want to welcome you to Book Talk. This is a program that we've been running through the Center for Book Arts since 2019. It started pretty close to the pandemic. And at that time, we held the sessions live. And then we went online, which I think has been very successful in that people from all over the world have been able to join us. So I'm really happy that it has continued. And we invite scholars and curators and publishers and anyone who has a broad view about artist books and the field so that we can have more dialogue about it. Because a lot of us had been feeling like we didn't have enough critical dialogue about artist books, and we wanted to change that. So I thank you, Kinohi, for being part of this. So Kinohi is a writer, scholar, and associate professor of English and African American Studies at Princeton. He is the author of Street Players, Black Pulp Fiction, and the Making of a Literary Underground, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2018. In progress is Black Paratext, a study of how book design has influenced the production and reception of African American literature from the rise of the paperback in the 1940s to the contemporary book art scene. Recently, Kinohi wrote the article, How Does the Artist Book? For the first edition of the Book Arts Review of BAR, or BAR as it's referred to. He proposes that we use the word book as a verb. And I'm quoting, what's important about an object is not its self-definition, but its doing, its affordances in the time and space of experience and encounter. I encourage you to get a copy of BAR so that you can read this article in its entirety. Acutely aware of how he is experiencing the book, both visually and tactily, most makers would agree that Kinohi is the ideal person you would want to encounter your work. Tonight's talk, Blues for Black Childhood, will look at the work of Toni Morrison, Gwendolyn Brooks, Clarissa T, Sligh, and Shervone Neckles, how they quote unquote stage the reading experience on their own terms, and perhaps not according to what we have grown to accept as fitting into the genre of artist books. Maybe we can resist labeling and open up the dialogue to consider artists who are working consciously with the book to act upon the reader. Kinohi, I hope I've done you proud. Please. The stage.
You certainly have. You certainly have. And I thank you for that kind introduction. What I'm going to do is start sharing my screen, and we'll go right into the talk. And I really look forward to this conversation and hearing from everyone assembled in the audience, whether through chat during the course of my talk or certainly during the Q&A period. So thank you all for being here. With that, I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to start my slideshow. First, I want to thank Kinohi Reynolds for the kind invitation to participate in Book Talk. It's quite an honor to be part of the Center for Book Arts. And really, this talk I see as a culmination of a couple of years of working with the staff there to really bring the field's discourse about my own work into resonant conversation. Roni Gross, I thank you for moderating and facilitating my talk today, and Caroline Wood for the technical and logistical support. In the school year 1964-1965, a white Harvard-educated Rhodes Scholar named Jonathan Kozol taught fourth grade in the Boston public school system. The civil rights movement had reached its apogee, and Kozol channeled his youthful idealism into working with and living among the Black community in a city that, for the most part, had escaped mainstream attention on Southern intransigence to desegregation. What he found during that year shocked him, an effect of the systemic confinement of Black people to Boston's ghettos. The students whom he taught were packed into failing schools that were under-resourced, understaffed, and uncared for. Buildings were in disrepair, teachers were at turns indifferent and patronizing, and the administrators who ran the Boston public school system really were in no hurry to address the service inequities between white and Black students. It dawned on Kozol that the system was segregating in all ways but name only. As he became more vocal about his opinions over the course of the year, he met resistance from his white colleagues, most notably from someone he simply refers to as the reading teacher. Kozol noted that her defense of the status quo at the school seemed to come from a good place. There are, I suppose, all kinds of prejudice and discrimination, he wrote in his account of the year, Death at an Early Age. And not all of it is either obvious or overtly brutal. There is also a kind of prejudice that is swaddled around with appearances of benevolence and of compassion, and the kind that is expressed commonly not as an explicit hostility to Negroes, so much as an affectionate preference for a, quote, different type of child. The reading teacher exemplified such prejudice for Kozol. A critical part of this benign neglect was the reading material that had been assigned to Black children. Kozol called the material dry and deadly basic reading textbooks, noting that most of them were published by Scott Forsman. He singled out The New Streets and Roads, which the school would assign to lagging fourth graders. Kozol observes, no title could have been farther from the mark. Every cliche of bad American children's literature seemed to have been contained within this book. The names of the characters describe the flavor of the stories. Betty Jane Burns and Sarah Best and Miss Molly and Fluffy Tail and Miss Valentine of Maple Grove School. The children in my class had been hearing already for several years about Birmingham and Selma and tear gas and cattle prods and night courts and slumlords and jazz. To expect these children to care about books which even very comfortable suburban children would probably have found irrelevant and boring seemed to me futile. Yet there were no other books around. These were the only ones we had. Possibly it was a benevolent school lady's most dearly held belief that she could shut out the actual world in this manner and could make the world of these growing children as neat and aseptic as her own. When Kozol proposed that the school assign material even remotely connected to students' everyday realities, the response from the reading teacher was unequivocal. We cannot use books that are sordid. Children do not like gloomy stories. I haven't seen any evidence that children like to read, especially about things that are real. Kozol took it upon himself to assign a work he thought students might engage, Langston Hughes's poem, Ballad of the Landlord. The satirical poem reads in part, landlord, landlord, these steps has broken down. When you come up yourself, it's a wonder you don't fall down. $10 you say I owe you? $10 you say is due? Well, that's $10 more and I'll pay you till you fix this house up new. For that act of insubordination, he was fired. But his 1967 expose of his experience became a national bestseller and eventually won the National Book Award, catapulting Kozel to the echelons of liberal commentary on civil rights and social change. Earnest, incisive, and righteous, no one could deny the force of Kozel's critique. Boston-based Houghton Mifflin's packaging of the book reflects this tone. Title and author's name appear in a hue of blue, while the subtitle and image add splashes of white. But the black background predominates, not least because there's a big empty space between the subtitle and Kozel's name. The overall visual effect looks like a design for an LP. Yet, from today's point of view, this very packaging poses some difficult questions for us. Why the emphasis on death and destruction? We, of course, understand the white-controlled school system to be the object of indictment, but it tends to detract from Kozel's insistence that, quote, the world of those children was in a great many cases a good deal more interesting and more vital than that presented in the Scott Forsman narratives. The kids' social life seems to be bracketed here in favor of the polemical assertion that their lives have been cut short even before they've had a chance to live them. And what of the image? The obscuring of the girl's face through a kind of photorealistic framing makes this circular image look more like a peephole or hidden window onto the lives of Black children. That framing puts Kozel and the reader in an awfully weird place, at a remove from the kids, objectifying of their actions. Yet the ostensible benevolence of this gaze is assured once the book is turned over and Kozel appears among the crowd of children, the girl seen as surely being more comfortable in her element, herself gazing up at a peer. There's no blue here, and that's perhaps because Kozel has inserted himself into the frame, wiping away all the tears. That is, fighting for Black kids' equal access to education in ways no other white person has. He's positioned, in other words, to save them from a certain fate. These questions point to the double-edged discourse around Black childhood as an exemplary index of racial injury in the civil rights and post-civil rights era. If the codification of Jim Crow segregation in America was facilitated by an argument about adults' rights to commercial transport, the dismantling of that system was premised on an argument about the inherent iniquities of separate but equal education. The injuries suffered by Black children growing up in a segregated world became an essential part of the arguments presented in the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case. Kenneth and Mamie Clark's psychological experiments seem to prove that segregation instilled in Black children an inferiority complex that led them to denigrate characteristics in Black dolls, choosing instead to identify with white ones. That argument helped secure a judicial victory against segregation, and it lies behind subsequent efforts, like Kozel's, to redress a sense of lack or deficiency among children. But that very presumption of injury or lack is itself a debatable position to take, not because injury doesn't exist, but because the presumption stands apart from the systems that have produced it. It's Kozel saving the kids, not Kozel working with parents to fight the system. The blues note to Black childhood was a major feature of civil rights era print culture. Novels, photo books, magazines, journalism, and children's literature tackled the questions codified by Brown. How did Jim Crow affect the youngest among us? What self-perceptions did it cultivate in young people? And what were the vectors of impressibility in their social world? Catherine Capshaw advances a liberatory interpretation of depictions of Black childhood in African-American photo books, which makes for a fine riposte to death at an early age. However, insofar as Capshaw begins her study with a photograph of Emmett Till as a boy, prior to his murder by white vigilantes. A blues note underscores her analysis, even if it's not acknowledged. So it is that when it comes to these print culture materials, which have yet to be organized in any systematic way, not everything is resistant and liberatory, but neither is everything abject and condemned. The key would seem to be to learn how to read or perhaps listen to these materials differently, to learn how to understand the reconfiguration of Black childhood between injury and agency, for both are fictions of a false universalism that only white readers can enjoy. In what follows, I present a blues for Black childhood that different kinds of artists, novelist, poet, book artists, multidisciplinary artists have created in the wake of the civil rights movement. My observation is that beyond causal and contemporaneous white liberal framings of Black life, Toni Morrison, Gwendolyn Brooks, Clarissa T. Sligh, and Shervone Neckles conduct situations of reading Black childhood on the terms not of psychologization, but of interiority. These artists use books and other media to emphasize the fraught and disturbing, but also meaningful and abiding ways in which Black children negotiate a world through deeply felt experience. How they convey that experience is key. For even when Black children may experience terrible things, which these artists do not shy away from representing, it's never the case that such experience is held at arm's length, objectified for the reader's or observer's interpretation. This evidence of being, to use Darius Boss' term for the quality of locating Black queer subjectivity in the archives, I argue, is a Black feminist artistic commitment that we're able to track in various book or book-related forms in the post-civil rights moment. Toni Morrison's debut novel, The Bluest Eye, came out with Holt Reinhardt Winston in 1970. The story that this book has to relate is one of tragedy. And like the packaging of Kozel's book, the fact of this tragedy is avowed on the front cover. Except here, the nature of that tragedy is conveyed through the visualization of Morrison's words. The novel's preface is set in gray against a white background. So unlike Death at an Early Age peephole cover, which affirms the reader's distance from the scene of tragedy, Herb Lubalin and Jay Tribich's Dust Jacket challenges fundamental distinctions between inside and outside, text and paratext, and indeed writing and speaking. The prioritization of the author's words is clear. Indeed, one could say any reading of the novel in this edition begins with the cover, and that when the preface appears in the text, it's a reappearance or echo of the cover. And yet the design also negates any sense of self-presencing that these words might convey. The book's artifice is signaled by the phrasing, a novel by Toni Morrison, while a keen eye will pick up that the dots over lowercase i's are colored blue. Voice and artifact are rendered coextensive here, turning this into more than just a book to be consumed for its story. It's as though the book's design means to address us directly, and Morrison would have exercised whatever authority she could muster as a first-time Black woman author to insert these elements into the Bluest Eyes production. So consider the extension of this voice, if that's what it is, on the inside flap of the jacket. This is a love story, except there isn't much love in it. It's also a fairy tale, except only the fondest nightmares come true. It's a murder story, except the victim lives. It's not only a Black story, it's a very, very dark one. Belying the jacket's and certainly the flap's reputation for user-friendly copy, an astute, even brilliant gloss on the text is rendered as a poem. The title is repeated at the top. Otherwise, the poem stands alone with a lot of blank space left at the bottom. We still don't know who is speaking here. It's not quite the eye on the cover who has a sister and is a witness to Piccola Breedlove's fate. We might say Toni Morrison, yet the estrangement of author from word cannot be denied here too. The book, it would seem, is conducting a reading of itself, hence the redundant preposition by. The artifact does not provide a window onto some unfortunate reality. It is evidence of that reality, a manifestation of it. Holding it in your hands means you must involve yourself with it. That involvement is key. For Piccola's story, as the preface makes clear, is one of unbearable loss and despair. Death at an early age is one way of describing not only what happens to her, abused and impregnated by her father as she is, but also to her baby. Yet the final line of the preface doesn't leave it at that. There is really nothing more to say except why. But since why is difficult to handle, one must take refuge in how. The italicized second why and how show that there's more to the story than the abjection of others. And once we turn to the text itself, even before Claudia McTeer's narration begins, we see the prefatory material in a different register. Here is the house. It is green and white. It has a red door. It is very pretty. Here is the family. Mother, father, Dick, and Jane live in the green and white house. They are very happy. See Jane. She has a red dress. She wants to play. Who will play with Jane? See the cat. It goes meow, meow. Come and play. Come and play here with Jane. So the passage continues until a friend comes by and it concludes, play, Jane, play. Yet in the next two passages, the same text has its meaning deformed by the removal of punctuation, the striking of capitalization, and finally, the contraction of typographic space. At the direction of Morrison, whose typescript directs these changes, Richard Gabriel Rummans' design reveals a degeneration of text, which signifies the deconstruction of the sundry myths that go into propping up such a simple, uncomplicated story as that of Dick and Jane. The preface suggests that there's a kind of illegibility, an unthought of possibility at the heart of Dick and Jane's innocence. The deforming of the text in these three passages suggests that their story must collapse onto itself in order for us to begin to trace the outlines of that negation. The violence of Charlie Breedlove's subjection of Piccola to his will is terrible in itself, but the Dick and Jane typographic distortion means to create an atmosphere, following Christina Sharp, of pervasive white standards of girlhood, femininity, and beauty that Piccola fervently aspires to, but cannot realize. In short, true to the Clark's doll experiment, Piccola develops an inferiority complex. In the face of being told she's ugly by members of her own community, she wishes she could have blue eyes. It's only after the death of her baby and after news of Charlie's perfidy has spread that people begin to treat her differently. By this time, however, Piccola has suffered a break and retreats into a kind of madness, one in which she attributes people's changed behavior toward her to the fact that she finally has been granted her wish. Yet the reader is never fully able to keep that deterioration at arm's length, for chapter breaks in the narrative are denoted not by numbers or titles per se, but by repetitions of the Dick and Jane texts with no spaces between two lines of letters. Only the first word in each sequence can be read with any degree of ease. And that word in all instances has an indicative or imperative function with regard to vision. Hear, look, and see. So it is that by the time we realize the dreadfulness of Piccola's fate, we must wonder whether we haven't been in her head, that is, in her book, all along. Far from giving us a snapshot of a Black girl's symbolic death, Morrison's play with the Dick and Jane text creates an interior perspective where we are looking out from the bluest eye of them all. Piccola's point of view haunts the book, even at the margins of Claudia's first-person narrative. In this Piccola's Blues Blues achieve a strange power precisely through their diffusion throughout the text, overcoming any effort to divide self from other, reader from character, a safe perspective from Piccola's suffering. The differences between The Bluest Eye and Death at an Early Age are only sharpened when one considers their point of overlap. Scott Forsman was the publisher of the Dick and Jane primers. The characters were the creation of Scott Forsman textbook editor Zerna Sharp. She worked with William S. Gray, the director of the company's Curriculum Foundation series, to devise a program for young children that would help them with word recognition through sight reading. Dick and Jane were the older brother and sister of a middle-class American family consisting of mother, father, a younger sister named Sally, and two pets, initially a cat and a dog. The ostensible typicalness of the family formed the foundation on which new words could be introduced into any given storyline. With the aid of Eleanor B. Campbell's illustrations, whiteness was rendered synonymous with the baseline norms that this family represented. Sharp and Gray's collaboration debuted in the Elson Gray primers in 1930 and were periodically updated and turned into other reading programs over the next several decades. As early as 1936, the primers honed in on Dick and Jane as the characters children identified with the most. And by 1940, the reader was rebranded with the title Fun with Dick and Jane, a phrase that has entered into the cultural lexicon as a signifier of an all-American childhood. The books were popular throughout the country, assigned to teach millions of children how to read. But along with that widespread adoption came the broad normalization of middle-class whiteness as the standard to which children of all backgrounds implicitly had to compare themselves. In this way, the Dick and Jane primers were akin to the white dolls that the Clarks used in their experiment, a widely accepted baseline that instilled a sense of inferiority in those who struggled to see themselves in their representations. Kozel's response to Dick and Jane type texts is to see it as a problem of match. Black kids need something that reflects their so-called reality, something less suburban, something more like jazz. Morrison's approach is to see it as a problem of infrastructure. Racism is baked into the grammar of Dick and Jane. So the question is not to replace its content, but to sit with the implications of its blind spots. Morrison dwells in the blues of Piccola's experience. From Morrison's example on, we may begin to trace a Black feminist practice of refiguring childhood along the bias grain of the whole white heteropatriarchal ideal of Dick and Jane. Consider poet Gwendolyn Brooks's chapbook Aloneness, published by Broadside Press in 1971. The cover echoes some features of The Bluest Eye while deploying new design elements. For one, the color palette and layout are remarkably similar. Dudley Randall, publisher of the independent Black Arts Press in Detroit, conjures the blues feeling that Morrison puns on and uses the white background to serve as a contrast to the mood of aloneness. That said, the lettering of the title and author's name adds a note of whimsy to the text, perhaps giving it a look that would be appealing to young readers. To be sure, Leroy Foster's illustration of a boy posed as if in contemplation is the focus of our attention. He is the subject of aloneness, perhaps, and his expression is far from joyous. Yet, he doesn't look exactly sad either. Again, he looks like he's lost in thought, though not too lost since, after all, he's gazing straight at us. To the extent that the book explores the blues of Black childhood, the cover promises, it does so knowingly and against the readerly instinct for pathos. The epigraph to the book sheds light on Brooks's irreverent take on the subject. Quoting her mother, Nora Blakely, she writes, "I like aloneness, but I don't like loneliness. Aloneness is different from loneliness." That aloneness could be something to like is rather surprising. But the contrast to the more typical word loneliness suggests how aloneness could be something to cultivate, to nurture, rather than simply something to suffer from or to be subjected to. Unlike the Dick and Jane readers, Brooks relies on contrast and experience, not identification or definition, to help children understand the different feelings she wants to explore. Loneliness, for example, means you want somebody, or that you have not planned to stand somewhere with other people gone. Foster's illustrations complement the poetry nicely, isolating the boy whose face is now turned away from the reader. Aloneness, on the other hand, is delicious, like a red, small apple that is cold, one that is small and sweet and round and cold and for just you. The building up of this chain of signification almost performs the feeling of abundance that Brooks wishes to align with aloneness. It's an interior abundance. So the poet is not content to sit even with that opposition between aloneness and loneliness. She then uses the rest of the book to tease out the different forms by which aloneness can take. The most obvious one being by oneself is a given. But then Brooks entertains the notion that one is never really by oneself in aloneness, since you are with you. And because you contain multitudes, and because pulse and nature keep you company, quote, your experience of the world is never self-consuming or strictly just about you. As if this philosophical turn weren't cool enough, Brooks then posits that there's aloneness within which there is someone to ask and tell, and they go by the names Mary, Willie, John, or James, or Joan. These someones also go by the name love. Here, Foster's image of the boy tucked in the arms of a woman caregiver shows how the deepest kind of aloneness would open oneself up to experiencing love, of needing it, of asking for it, whether from a caregiver, kin, or friends. That Brooks studiously avoids aligning love with a hackneyed conception of motherhood is essential to the movement of aloneness. By the end of the book, words like loneliness and aloneness, as well as the child's conception of himself in the world, are transformed. I hope that by putting Morrison and Brooks together, as different as their works might be, we can begin to appreciate the work of an established book artist in a different light. Clarissa T. Sligh created her artist book, Reading Dick and Jane with Me, at the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester in an edition size of 1,000. In genre, design, and non-commercial format, this is a departure from Morrison's and Brooks's works. The title is a savvy reworking of Fun with Dick and Jane, putting the artist in the position of sharing her thoughts on the series with the reader. Me, therefore, announces itself as the window through which one might begin to understand how white supremacy reproduces itself through the norms of schooling. Yet this departure is really one of degree, not one of kind. Sligh can afford to be more explicit about her critique because the artist's book facilitates her direct address more than the commercial novel or the small press chapbook. Yet it should be clear by now that all three women orbit around similar questions in these works, and that conveying the experience of Black childhood's particularity in a white-dominated world is a project shared among them. Sligh might even be thought of as mediating between the aesthetic and design features of The Bluest Eye and Aloneness. On one hand, the typographical distortion of the primer's language is a key element of the book's design. Though Sligh does not eradicate spaces between words as radically as Morrison, the repetition of even shorter units of words has a similar dulling or a confounding effect, emptying them out of the substance they mean to signify. Such a layout conveys a more muted version of the feeling left by the chaotic layout of the covers. Whereas the front cover limits the effect to the frame, The back cover scatters phrases in a haphazard fashion, showing them to be meaningless in a world of racial stratification, where Dick and Jane's play is unsubstantiated for poor and working class Black children. This design must be put into conversation with Morrison's effort to give us a glimpse into Piccola's interior. But this isn't the only organizing principle of reading Dick and Jane with me. It's precisely the avowal of with me that brings the book into relation with aloneness. The intimate register of direct address allows the reader to be part of a we, you and me, that in Sly's book offers a countervailing response to the Dick and Jane ideology. In facing page layouts, photographs of her siblings and kids from the neighborhood where she grew up speak back to the Dick and Jane primers in handwritten words. You play in your good clothes every page. We must keep ours nice for Sunday school days, reads one. Our parents want us to read this stuff. We heard our teachers say we're not smart enough, says another. Here, very much like Brooks, the language abjures cheap affirmations to articulate whip-smart observations that, at root, affirm the critical capacities of Black kids. Arrayed in a line, these children have each other, even if the books overlook their presence and the adults underestimate them. If my readings of this Black feminist artistic practice are persuasive, then we can and should take our concerns beyond the book itself and see how it ramifies in other works. Here, the interdisciplinary artist Shervone Neckles proves instructive. Though Neckles has very much engaged with printmaking and book arts, I'm interested in highlighting one of her mixed media installations in this presentation. The Tales of Red Rag Rosie debuted in the Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Harlem State Building in 2005. Dolls are featured prominently in the exhibition, and they disturb in the combination of ordinary features with horrifying details. In a rocking chair, Red Rag Rosie cradles Little Miss Pinky, the former sporting an alien grin that makes it look like she's ready to consume the latter. In a tiny school chair, meanwhile, an unidentified doll with dark coloring sits reading what Neckles identifies as an original Dick and Jane primer from the 1940s. The monstrosity of Red Rag Rosie seems to be counterbalanced by the upturned head of this doll, who's eager to learn how to read from Dick and Jane. Except that proves monstrous in its own right. For other objects in the show recount a history of kidnapping and enslavement in which the dolls are implicated. The small doll, for example, is shown being stolen away from its kin by a white doll dressed in seafaring garb. Eerily, the lack of expressive features, the refusal of cliched identification, does not prevent us from noting, through gesture and a kind of stilled choreography, the tragedy at the heart of this situation. A story quilt that picks up from the small doll's kidnapping then leads to a terrible realization. This is Red Rag Rosie's story. In 6 panels, we see Rosie's kidnapping, crossing the Middle Passage, auctioning off, batting about and manhandling, taking flight, bearing witness to violence against Black people, and then hiding, waiting, observing. It's a remarkable sequence, one that uses a traditional Black folk art to convey the weight of a traumatic history, made somehow more tragic by the simplicity of the figural shapes, the nonchalance, even innocence of a whole class of people turning others into property. The dominant color palette here is, unsurprisingly, blue. But that's not the end of the story. Rosie's waiting turns into action. In an exact inverse of the way she was stolen, she grabs the white doll by the head and takes flight once again. This image is granted its own quilt, as if to emphasize its importance, and it also appears on the ground of the installation as a rug. It's not enough, in other words, to run away. Neckles wishes to depict a rebellion of symbols, an uprising of the spirit that would do away with the infrastructure of white supremacy once and for all. It's her way of rewriting the Dick and Jane primers. To that end, we see a red monoprint, Two Girls at Play, that revises one of the story quilt panels into what we can presume to be two black girls playing with Little Miss Pinky. Outlined in white are other figures who may be their spirits or ancestors, who suddenly appear alongside and around them, freed as they are from the imposition of whiteness onto their world. And as the color palette shifts decisively to red here, Neckles leaves us with Rebirth, a linoleum cut that shows how Blackness may be redefined after enslavement, in flight from enslavement, with a new template for being. Rosie's eyes, we might say, hover over the figure reborn, a new version of herself. The eye, finally, is where Neckles, Sligh, Brooks, and Morrison leave us with in advocating a revolution in perspective, a different way of thinking about race, reading, and childhood in America. In their works, the eye is not an input mechanism for literacy, something to fill in with lessons on how to be a good girl, citizen, or subject. Rather, the eye looks out, looks back at that world which would create entire programs and curricula for reading with nary a Black child in mind. And if appreciating the totality of that vision means stepping out of the book arts field to show how someone like Clarissa T. Sligh is always already in conversation with Toni Morrison, Gwendolyn Brooks, and commercial print culture writ large, then that's all for the better, I think, because the interconnections enliven our understanding of all three. Neckles instantiates this capacious view of book arts by approaching it not as delimited by artifacts, but as inspired by curation. It's a way of putting objects in relation to each other, drawing on some of the materials and concepts long associated with book culture: print transmission, reading, reception. This curatorial eye is what facilitates a hearing of blues for Black childhood, a lower frequency of refusing the innocence of America's conception of itself. Thanks so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion ahead.
Thank you so much, Kinohi. That was so interesting. I mean, I feel like even though I read a lot of Toni Morrison, I obviously missed, I wasn't as observant as you were at all. We have a question from Megan Liberty, who says, I'm curious how you were able to determine how much direct input these writers had on the design of their book covers and typesetting. This is something that is challenging for me in my own writing about artist books that are published by larger presses. I'm not always sure how much design comes from the publisher or the artist writer.
That's a great question, Megan, and thank you for the compliment in chat. There is in the back channels of this presentation, which one might also call its footnotes or endnotes, a series of findings, a series of engagements with the archive that try to substantiate the point you're making about how much can you assign to, for example, Morrison and Brooks in terms of the certainly the design of the covers, the design of the books, but also even typesetting. And in that apparatus, in my footnotes and in my engagement with, in particular, Morrison's and Brooks archives, I'm able to make as good of a case as I can that they had an unusually close relationship with the production process for very different reasons. In Brooks's case, it's because she was moving to broadside press and beginning to publish with a Black arts publisher, Dudley Randall, who gave poets and authors more leeway in decisions about how their books were designed than certainly a mainstream commercial press would have allowed. While I cannot definitively say that she had a hand in every single data point that I presented to you tonight, I am proceeding along the general spirit of the collaboration that she had with Dudley Randall to suggest that she had more of a say in it than other authors would have had with commercial publishers. So really, in the footnotes, what you're seeing here is an argument about what are the conditions that allow for novelists, poets, artists to have more of a say in the production of their commercial works than you might expect. And it's not an exact science, but it's one that has to find evidence in the archive of collaboration in general, of correspondence in general, and that's what I think I found with Brooks. Believe it or not, that's also what I've found to a degree with Morrison, because even though this was Morrison's debut novel, and even though Holt was not the publisher that she eventually would have a relationship with as an editor, which would have been Random House, for reasons that we still need to think about, she had enough of a kind of conception of what she wanted to do with her book that she directed those typographic decisions to a degree that I'm comfortable saying became pretty much part of the fabric of the story itself. So, for example, some of the playing with typographic space in the prefaces, with the Dick and Jane primers, and in the chapter titles, you see evidence of that in the typescript. And what I'm doing there in the endnotes or in the footnotes is saying that evidence of this being in her mind in the typescript, and it's exactly 2 lines. It's not, just run-on sentences that then the designer takes up and makes into 2 lines. That evidence in her typescript, in her composing of the Bluest Eye, suggests that she had a greater hand to play in the production of her book. Very unusual for its time, very unusual deference paid to her by Holt Reinhardt. But I feel comfortable saying that that's the case. So in each of these instances where we can't really assign a clear sense of agency to people working with commercial presses or even small presses, we have to make our best guess based on the available evidence. And I hope I've done that tonight.
Caroline, do you want to unmute everyone so that they can ask questions live?
Great idea. Just give me one moment.
While we're waiting, Kira asks, did Miss Brooks know Leroy Foster personally?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but what I will say is that Brooks, of course, was the great Chicago poet, and she lived there most of her life. And she worked with Dudley Randall, who was based in Detroit. Brooks knew all the artists, all the Black arts, poets, graphic artists, illustrators, designers based in Chicago. That was her scene. She was heavily involved with Obasi, the local Black arts organization. And she also knew all the artists who were affiliated with John Johnson's magazines, Ebony, Jet, Negro Digest, later Black World. Leroy Foster was part of the Detroit Black arts scene. And while I suspect both of these figures are part of the greater Midwest, she would have known him in some capacity. I can't say that she had an intimate knowledge of him like she would have had with Chicago artists and poets. But what is clear is that location and region played a huge role in Black arts productions. And as I write about in my forthcoming book, Black Paratext, one of the revolutions in print that Black arts augured was a revolution in surfacing Black design histories, Black illustrator histories, Black graphic artist histories from hubs across America that had no chance of making it in New York. So a Chicago look, a Detroit look, a Bay Area look, a New Orleans, Atlanta look. All of these graphic artists who had long been ignored by mainstream arts institutions had a chance with Black arts publishers and newspapers and little magazines to surface their work. And Leroy Foster was definitely part of that in Detroit.
Okay, so anybody who would like to ask a question, please feel free to do so. Michelle said, I missed the beginning of the talk, but I'm a children's literature scholar and would love to share this work with my students and read more of it myself. Is this a part of a book project? Chapter we can read later, awesome talk. I don't get the book arts critical lens often, so it was fascinating. And Kinohi, I don't know if you know the name Sandra Krupa, but she is a very well-known and held in high esteem special collections librarian who worked at the University of Washington libraries for many, many years and probably built that collection. Anyway, I guess she told her about the talk. So is this part of your new work?
What I presented to you tonight, and thank you for the compliment, and thank you for coming tonight. And I appreciate Sandra's recommendation of the event. What I presented to you tonight is the first time I'm presenting this material in the shape that it's taken. And again, I want to thank Corinna for the opportunity to share this, because that book arts angle is unique to tonight's audience. And it really helped me in some ways curate my own examples to speak to each other in ways that are even new to my own thinking. So what do I mean by that? I work mainly with commercial and small press publishing histories among Black authors from the 1940s to the present. The book arts angle, Clarissa Sligh, and to an extent Shervone Neckles, asked me to relate my expertise in commercial and small press publishing to book arts and to installations and multimedia art in ways that I hope were persuasive tonight. So Blues for Black Childhood, as you heard it tonight, is unique to this occasion. And if you contact me afterwards, I'd be happy to make this work available to you in a way that can't be cited, but that you'll have the text to share with your students. What I will say is that in my scholarship and in my forthcoming book, Black Paratext, the materials on Toni Morrison, right, that material that I presented to you tonight is really the heart of how I'm thinking about really important innovations in American book design that Black writers advanced in the 1970s and 80s. And typically when we think about them, we think about these advancements as advancements in aesthetics or in literary language, postmodernism, for example. But I think for a lot of these writers, it was also an advancement in their ability to, if I may be so bold, infiltrate the mainstream publishing industry. And the evidence of people like Toni Morrison, like Ishmael Reed, like William Melvin Kelly, publishing with the big New York houses and publishing these wild novels and books that incorporate different media, that do typographic play like I shared with you tonight, is a history that we have not even begun to wrap our heads around. So the heart of my current research in this period can be found in what I present on Morrison, but I do hope to develop the larger argument around book arts in a different kind of audience. So if you have any ideas of how I can go about doing that, please share them with me.
I know that Shervone is here. Is she still here? Let's see. Maybe not. Too bad. We missed our opportunity to talk with her. But okay, so last call, everybody. Okay, another question. Has your research included movable or pop-up books?
They have not included that, but as a scholar of mainly commercial and small press book design, I'm always trying to learn more. And again, this is why I value my connections with Center for Book Arts. One way I'm sort of educating myself in that direction is by studying the work of Tia Blassingame, who, there's kind of a personal connection insofar as Tia happens to be a Princeton alumna. And even though, even with that connection, Princeton hadn't really collected her works. And so following Tia's visit to campus prior to the pandemic, I urged our library to collect Tia's book arts. And I think there are examples in there of movable and pop-up books that I want to study more as I get further into book arts criticism. The other part of it is that I am taking courses myself in movable books and book arts, both in Philadelphia and in New York with the Center for Book Arts. So one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that I was able to take some online courses with the center and just educating myself and educating my hands with the materials, with the processes, with the skills that it takes to build these books is something that I consider part of my education. So I really am trying to make this less a brainy or only a brainy thing, but more of a haptic experience. And kind of like how I responded to Megan, I would hope that the courses I've taken over the past 2 years have actually improved my writing on not just book arts, but books in general, which again, it'll be in the endnotes or it'll be in the back channels, but I hope that it comes through in the prose and in the quality of analysis.
Thank you.
It does. I think Robin Lynch has a question. Robin?
Hi, thank you, and great presentation. It was about the correlation that you made. Who was the soft sculpture artist that you showed again, please? The soft sculpture?
That was Shervone.
Oh, really? That was Shervone, who's not here now?
Right.
Oh, man. That comparison, is that a comparison that you're drawing, or were the authors, is that a connection you're making in your mind?
The connection between the installation,
the kind of narrative, the whole, sort of everything that body of work embodies, and what some of the points you were drawing out of.
I get what
Okay.
you mean. I get what you're asking, and this I've learned from Roni and Corinna that BookTalk often features artists and speaking about their own work and avowing their own ideas behind their work. I am a scholar. I'm a professional critic, and even though it might have seemed like I was quoting Shervone in terms of the intentions behind the installation, and particularly the story quilt, these are my interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
And again, my work as a scholar is premised on the idea that I am trying to get at the truth, and that there's enough in my background and expertise so that even if I don't always say it, the footnotes, the endnotes, the reading, and everything behind the presentation helps make the best possible case for the interpretations and readings that I present to you. So that reading of the story quilt and my whole account of moving in that space is, if I might say, quote, mine, but really what I simply mean is I've learned so much from Shervone Neckles, and I'm trying to do justice to her work, and I'm trying to do justice to her process. So not an artist talk, but as a scholar, I really hope to do justice to artists and writers and poets and give them credit for what I think is happening behind their work.
great. That because it was a wonderful juxtapositioning. And one other point, I guess, or confession, but I'm an art director and graphic designer, and my sense is that the book jacket for Bluest Eye is a designer who's not related to the content, and maybe is Toni Morrison's, but the work inside the book that was being done typographically to me is much more sublime and powerful than I think that the dotting of the eyes with a blue dot is a bit trite compared to what's going on in the interior. And I just would hazard, if I had to hazard a guess, I would think that the publisher in-house design people did the cover, and that the other, the what did you call it? The text script, the book script. Yeah, that was more from the author's hand, that was at the author's direction, and as a result is much richer. That's just my critical review.
Absolutely. And that is based on your own understanding of how these processes work. And it gets at Megan's question about how can we delineate Morrison's hand versus Holt Reinhardt's. I think I'm with you in terms of the cover, the jacket. Let's be specific. And as I mentioned, Lubelin and Tribic are the designers of the jacket. This is not Morrison's design. But something that I'm presenting to you tonight, which hasn't gotten any attention, really, and you think to yourself, is there any other author who's been more written about than Toni Morrison, is that inside flap. That inside flap, which is a poem, I'm telling you, is not Lubelin and Tribic, and it's not anyone at Holt Reinhardt, which gets me to think, even though Morrison is not credited for any part of the jacket, that inside flap, which no one to my knowledge has talked about, either in scholarship or in criticism, begs the question of where Morrison's hand is, how she wants to infuse the whole book with a voice, not her own, but with a voice that haunts it, And that poem is something that really sticks with me. And I hope everyone here tonight can do your own work in tracking down, if you can, original copies with the jacket, because I'm telling you, reading The Bluest Eye in that form is a different experience from just your trade paperback from Plume, perhaps your Oprah's Book Club edition. Anyway, all these things that we understand is just a simple part of transmission and reproduction. But when I saw that inside flap, I thought, even my suppositions about, as I said earlier, the binaries between inside and outside, right? Text block versus the inessential dust jacket were challenged, because I thought, by golly, if my supposition that this is Morrison's at least artistic intent to put that poem in there, we do a disservice by getting rid of that dust jacket, as libraries used to do. So I totally hear you, and I think my own aesthetic instinct is with yours, but that inside flap, inside outside jacket, text block, really
it's the overture. It's the overture,
Hi, I have a question. Speaking of The Bluest Eye, the character of Pecola Breedlove, do you have a recommendation for the male version of Pecola Breedlove? Do you know of a book where you had such a character that was so self-loathing and desired whiteness, probably white woman, like a male version, but yeah. Do you know of any that were written?
There's not quite that same quality of gendered abjection, of that feeling of not living up to standards of beauty, is going to be unique to books about girlhood and womanhood. And so I think this is why The Bluest Eye is almost a kind of touchstone text, because simply put, boys and men's, if you will, desire for whiteness isn't going to have that same quality of hurt and just kind of getting into their head. But nonetheless, even with that caveat, I can say that there are, one way of going about this is saying invisible man, right? Even though it's by no means as kind of fraught as The Bluest Eye. In many respects, the unnamed narrator, he's not exactly desiring whiteness, but he's certainly doing whiteness's bidding at the beginning of the narrative. And the whole journey, the whole epic journey of Invisible is to sort of find himself and to reject the standards that the white benefactors in his small southern town have foisted on him. As his grandfather says, they'll keep you running. But in Morrison's moment, there are experimentalists, Black experimental novelists who are thinking about this question for Black men and for Black boys. But the register is very different. It's satirical. It's parodic. It's much more kind of freewheeling and just kind of bizarre, if you will. But what's the point of connection? Their efforts to tweak book design to kind of create new kinds of reading experience for readers and to essentially frustrate white expectations for what a Black book can do. On this count, I would point you to Charles Wright's The Wig. Charles Wright's The Wig, which is an experimental novel about a Black man who thinks he has blonde hair. Anyway, that would definitely be a kind of point of comparison. And I would also recommend William Melvin Kelly's novel, and you already heard his name, Dunford's Travels Everywheres, which was published by Doubleday and is really a novel about an educated, college-educated Black man who surrounds himself with white friends, who goes on a trip to Europe to lose himself. And through a kind of Joycean Finnegan's Wake play of language and book design, discovers that he's really, his kind of twin is a hustler in Harlem. So as you can already tell, the men tend to approach the same issues through a more parodic and freewheeling lens. But what makes them sort of conversant with Morrison's The Bluest Eye is their commitment to effing up mainstream publishing and giving them books that really are wild to produce, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, you know what? It's so interesting because why I asked that question, I've been really toying with the idea of writing one because I know a real life male Pecola Breedlove. And I don't think that story has been told because like you were saying in the beginning of your response, how it may look different than white, Black womanhood, but it actually plays out the same way, but also could be extremely damaging as well. Because you have a lot of kids, because I'm also a professor and I go into classrooms a lot. And I had this little one Black boy who was saying that, Black people are savages and constantly repeating it. And he was the darkest one in the room. And I just wanted to get into his head of what, who he's heard this from. And I asked him who he had and, pointed at him into the right direction. But those stories need to be told about Black boys too, because they definitely embody that psychosis as well. But thank you for the recommendation.
I wholeheartedly endorse you writing that children's book or YA novel or because it is approaching it it doesn't have to be sort of tragic, but approaching it with a kind of seriousness that really understands, and here's the difference with the satirists of the 70s and the 60s, understanding Black masculinity to be just as vulnerable as femininity is something that I think hasn't been explored enough in literature writ large. I think Kia Suleiman, among other writers today, are exploring questions of vulnerability, but vulnerability to the point where you do take on these negative self-perceptions, which laymen cannot be, is something that I think would very much be welcome today in today's literary culture, because it's a degree of going there. There's a reason why The Bluest Eye is routinely, unfortunately, banned and petitioned to be banned by communities all over the country, because it's the degree of going there and saying, you know, this is a problem, is oftentimes too much for people to bear. And to even apply that to Black boys, I think is a necessary conversation, because boyhood is vulnerable too, especially Black boyhood. And if we don't want to talk about it, then that's really a shame on us. So thank you.
Making the same mistake. Thank you, Kinohi. And we're so happy that you joined us tonight. I want to tell you all that the next book talk is going to be on January 31st at noon with Claudia Delatorre, who's coming to us from Berlin. So I hope you'll keep an eye out for that and join us in January. And everyone have a nice holiday. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks everyone so much for attending today.